This is Irish Books, for intelligent discussions of contemporary Irish writing. In Colm Tóibín's fiction, communities are torn apart by migration, not only when loved ones leave, but when they return. This episode considers the sequel to the award-winning Brooklyn. Irish Books is hosted by Christopher Murray.
Colm Tóibín's Brooklyn is a highly regarded account of emigration from Ireland to America in the 1950s. Tóibín has returned to the character of Ailish Lacey in a sequel set a quarter of a century later. To discuss this sequel with me, I have Matthew Ryan. Hello, Matt.
Hi, Chris.
Matt, could you please give us an idea of how we find Ailish at the beginning of Long Island?
Yeah, we find her 25 years later, after Brooklyn. So it's set in 1976. And she is a successful immigrant, I suppose, is what we would say, integrated into a family of Italian Americans, married to Tony Fiorello. But the opening of the novel is interesting because there's a crisis right at the beginning.
Page one.
The crisis is there, where Ailish is confronted by a man, an Irish man, who claims that Eilish's husband, Tony, has made his wife pregnant.
Oh, dear.
and he's threatening to, when the baby arrives, leave it on her doorstep.
And Ailish is not happy about this.
She is not happy about this, as you would expect. Unsurprising. But it's interesting, though, how reticent she is to say how unhappy she is about it, which is perhaps characteristic of the novel, which we might talk about a bit more. But she makes it plain eventually to Tony that she won't care for this child. She has two teenage children already and obviously doesn't feel well disposed to bring up someone else's child. But there are machinations that go on in the background.
Sure are. And for one thing, she's surrounded at close proximity by her in-laws, and they seem to feel differently, don't they?
Yes, they live in their neighbourhood in Long Island. It seems to be some sort of cul-de-sac that they're living in, so that she's next door to Tony's brothers and their wives and her parents-in-law.
If he had been Italian or plain American, she would not have been sure how to judge whether he was making a threat he had no intention of carrying out. He was, she thought, a man who liked the sound of his own voice, but she recognised something in him. A stubbornness, perhaps even a sort of sincerity. She had known men like this in Ireland. Should one of them discover that their wife had been unfaithful and was pregnant as a result, they would not have the baby in the house. At home, however, no man would be able to take a newborn baby and deliver it to another household. He would be seen by someone. A priest or a doctor or a guard would make him take the baby back. But here, in this quiet cul-de-sac, the man could leave a baby on her doorstep without anyone noticing him. He really could do that. And the way he spoke, the set of his jaw, the determination in his gaze, convinced her that he meant what he was saying. Once he had driven away, she went back into the living room and sat down. She closed her eyes. Somewhere, not far away, there was a woman pregnant with Tony's child. Ailish did not know why she presumed that the woman was Irish too. Perhaps her visitor would be more likely to order an Irish woman around. Anyone else might stand up to him or leave him. Suddenly, the image of this woman alone with a baby coming back to look for support from Tony frightened her, even more than the image of a baby being left on her doorstep. But then that second image too, when she let herself picture it in cold detail, made her feel sick. What if the baby was crying? Would she pick it up?
At the beginning, when she argues with Tony's father about military service, and they have opposing views, and soon afterward, Francesca, Ailish's mother-in-law, suggests that Ailish might not like to attend Sunday lunch every week.
Yeah. She's given a certain degree of latitude, I think, because she's Irish, I think, is one of the reasons why she might be argumentative. But yeah, as she begins to assert herself, there is some tension, which differentiates her from her sisters-in-law and their families, that they behave differently to Eilish and her children, and particularly her daughter Rosella, who seems to be taking after Eilish and is more perhaps intellectual in her approach to things. And so there's a certain sort of tension in the way that the families are growing and the direction they're going. So I think there
are barriers. So one does not simply become American. That's clear in the novel. There are barriers between Italian Americans and Irish Americans. And it also seems very undemocratic that Ailish isn't allowed to have this opinion that conflicts with her father-in-law, that they have retained this sense of hierarchy, which I suppose is true of their own family. So America is certainly not idyllic.
No, and it's a pretty classical patriarchal sort of structure that's going on here, and America doesn't dismantle that for Ailish. So it becomes more of a problem because Ailish is more confident.
Yes.
And particularly the Ailish we meet in Brooklyn, who is very young and is passive, largely passive, she emigrates because she's told to by her sister and by Father Flood, and they look after it all, and she just goes along with it. Now she's much more self-active.
She's assertive, and she gets the job in the garage outside the family. Yeah. That's significant.
Yeah. I think there's a certain degree of respect for her in that regard, but she's also a dangerous character because she thinks for herself to some degree. And so when she's confronted with the crisis, she takes it into her own hands and takes advantage of the fact that her mother is turning 80 back in Enniscorthy and goes back to Ireland to get a bit of space whilst the crisis unfolds back in Long Island.
So she plans to miss the point at which the baby will be born, and she wants it to have been resolved before she returns. That's the understanding with which she leaves.
Yes, and because, as we noted, her extended family are making plans without her in regard to this. So and she's made it plain that she won't be involved in that. So leaving Tony to take a chance. That's where we leave Long Island. And we were talking before, it's strange that this novel is called Long Island because most of it actually occurs in Enniscorthy in County Wexford.
Long Island is fairly remote. I suppose no one's going to buy a novel called Enniscorthy.
Maybe it was pragmatic, mercenary reasons. Yeah, I think perhaps it also contextualises Enniscorthy. So we see Enniscorthy via having been in Long Island, and that's at the centre of the novel in many ways, that this is a returned immigrant story. And so the framing through the American experience is key to it.
And how does Ailish find Enniscorthy as a changed place when she returns and finds that the people she knew have moved on?
She, interestingly, she again is assertive, and it's interesting how she responds to her mother in particular, who has gone on in her life with the shame that Ailish has left with her, because we should note that she leaves Enniscorthy in Brooklyn a second time.
With a note of scandal.
With a definite note of scandal.
So in Brooklyn, to clarify, at one point Ailish returns home to visit Ireland. Is that because her sister has died?
Yes,
I think
her
it
sister
is.
Rose dies.
And a couple of interesting things happen. One, we talked about Ailish often being forced to do things in Brooklyn. And as I recall, it is when she announces that she intends to leave Brooklyn for a time to visit Ireland that Tony insists that they marry. He will not allow her to leave the country unless they marry beforehand. And then Ailish travels to Enniscorthy for the visit in Brooklyn, and she has a love affair of sorts with Jim Farrell.
Jim Farrell, that's right. And interestingly, in that regard, it's again framed by her returning from the US, and that she's newly attractive in some ways.
She's glamorous.
She's glamorous.
It's the 1950s, yeah.
She brings the glamour of the United States of America to Enniscorthy, and people take notice of her, including this eligible bachelor, Jim Farrell, who owns the pub, whose family own the pub on the Market Square. Can I read a little bit from Brooklyn? Because I think it's interesting that the way she's framed in that.
Please do.
She says, and 2 years ago, Eilish remembered, when Jim Farrell had been openly rude to her, she thought it was because she came from a family that did not own anything in the town. Now that she was back from America, she believed she carried something with her, something close to glamour, which made all the difference to her as she sat with Nancy watching the men talk. So suddenly she's noticeable when she comes back and starts this affair with Jim Farrell and starts to seem to believe that she can stay. Mm. And there's a certain fantasy that seems to be going on there where she thinks about divorce and the possibilities. But then she's outed and she must flee and she rushes back.
She's outed. It's interesting because she's outed when the news that she is already married is transmitted from New York, and it shows us how far gossip can reach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's another interesting thing in the novel, both novels, around the connections of community and the value of that and the support that provides, but also this kind of surveillance that provides, and that there's difficult to escape from that, even transatlantic surveillance.
So that love affair with Jim Farrell in Brooklyn is an important context for Long Island because, of course, Eilish is going back to her hometown. And yet, Tóibín complicates that a little because Jim Farrell is no longer simply an eligible bachelor, is he?
Yeah. Well, it's 25 years later, and we've got to bear this in mind, that this is a long time after. They're middle-aged now. All of them have lived lives, but Jim Farrell seems to have stayed static. He's still in the pub and he seems relatively satisfied with that, and the complication that you referred to, that Nancy, who was Nancy Byrne in Brooklyn, who's now Nancy Sheridan,
a widow,
is having an affair with Jim.
Which they think is a secret.
They think is a secret, but everybody seems to know, of course, except for Eilish. Who then takes up the affair with Jim when she returns. And Jim is between them.
What is he attracted to in Eilish? Is it the past, or is it simply that she appears to offer him the opportunity of a new life that he too might reimagine himself in America? Is that as much part of it as anything to do with the woman herself?
I think that's a very interesting idea, because I think it's both at the same time. I think he's attracted to this youthful affair that they had, this sort of moment, and the disappointment and the shame that he was left behind is obviously he's wanting to overcome that when she returns. But I think there is also the imagined possibility of going to the US, and he puts this out as a possibility, and he, towards the end of the novel, says, what if I appeared in the US, what would you do? And she doesn't answer.
No, she never answers.
She never answers. By that stage, there are a few other contingencies in the story. But I suspect, speculatively, I don't think she's that interested in him really in that regard. I don't think she wants to take an Irish husband home back to the US.
No, and it's another baffling part of the novel to me that, likewise, I can't quite see why Eilish is attracted to Jim Farrell, if only perhaps for the idea that she could rewind time and go back to a point before things got very complicated with her American husband, Tony.
Yeah, and it's a kind of another assertion of her autonomy, I think, this point, that she's already asserting that, as we talked about with her relation to her in-laws. But now it's a sort of, I think she requires that for her sense of self at this point, because she's been so betrayed. She's been left out high and dry by Tony in this sort of situation that she's been thrust into through his infidelity. And I think she asserts herself through this affair that she can do what she likes.
On the one hand, it sounds positive for a character such as Eilish to assert herself. On the other hand, The way in which she deals with people seems very self-interested and inconsiderate. And I have this, I'm going to call it like a theory of immigrants in fiction, that I feel like they can only ever imagine one place as real and the other place is a fantasy land. And Ailish in this novel sees America as real, but she sees Ireland as somehow inconsequential, and she passes through it like a wrecking ball without any consideration of what she does to other people's lives.
And that might be true for both novels in some ways, that The Return has diminished the reality of Enniscorthy because it's seen through the reality of the US situation for her. I think that's probably a good way to see it. I wouldn't call her a wrecking ball, but she is somewhat asserting her own desires, particularly in the second one in Long Island, in a reaction to the way that her life has been undermined by others, which is, I think, fair enough. Which is perhaps true of Brooklyn as well. It's a life she didn't really choose.
No, she's constantly in Brooklyn, the first novel, being impelled into situations, not simply the initial emigration, but the job she finds. And as I mentioned, the way in which she becomes engaged to Tony, it's all somewhat involuntary.
Yeah, that's right. There's a sense that things happen to her, particularly in Brooklyn, which she, in these 25 years later, and the experiences she's had, the bit of education she's had, the employment that she's now in, is now much more confident in taking control of her life. And so this crisis offers her a chance to do something new, I suppose. But I think that question of the unreality of Ireland and the damage done, perhaps it also goes the other way to some of the perceptions of her. And Nancy's relationship with her is interesting in that regard. It's interesting because they become rivals, but also in the perception of the returned immigrant, that's the successful immigrant coming back.
There's always a note of threat to the returned immigrant, even though there's something of an imposture about it, because as Ailish is leaving, her brother-in-law, Frank, gives her a pile of cash and she resists. And then he explains why. He says, the immigrant has to perform the role. You know, you've either made it or you haven't.
Yeah.
So you have to go back with money and rent a car and show that you've made it.
Yeah.
And of course, Ailish becomes more and more embarrassed when people comment on the car that she's rented. But by the same token, the returned immigrant who has succeeded is often a threat to people outside the family in particular.
Yeah. And I was trying to remember where I'd seen this before. And I think, that John McGahern story, the Country Funeral.
I don't.
Oh, it's a fantastic story. And I think Tóibín has noted the influence of McGahern more generally, but particularly that story. And there's three brothers, and one of them has been working overseas and is always, splashing money around, and there's a kind of building resentment against this successful. Yes. It's really, I think there's a certain resonance with that.
Well, of course, Ailish's own three brothers in this novel have very different stories. There's Jack, who has made a lot of money in England. There's Martin, who has stayed at home and who has made no money at all and drinks all the time. Yeah. And there's a third brother also in England. Is that Pat? But he is poor. He works in a warehouse and doesn't have a penny to his name.
So we've got the full range of possibilities of the immigrant experience.
Full palette of migratory life. Yeah.
That's right. And the loser who stays home,
Nancy, though, has no kind of family allegiance to Ailish there. There's always been an element of rivalry to a contemporary young woman, I suppose. And now later in life, Ailish has returned and Nancy measures herself against Ailish. And Nancy is running the chip shop, which is certainly not a glamorous career.
No, but it's making money.
Yes.
So she was running the local store, and that is pushed out by larger supermarket conglomerates who are emerging. Mm-hmm. And she's advised to go into the chip shop, which is low cultural status but high financial return. And she manages that and is doing well in that regard. And that's how she comes to be on Jim's sort of radar in some ways, because she's a small business owner like him.
So from this point at which Ailish has returned to Enniscorthy and reignited her love interest in Jim Farrell, all the while he is, unknown to her, engaged to Nancy, much of the novel is it's spent in a state of kind of wrangling and guessing what other people are thinking and feeling this sense of small town surveillance. And one thing I noticed in Long Island is that a number of phrases will recur again and again and again. Phrases like, it struck him, it occurred to her, and he realized. And these are usually moments at which characters become aware of or afraid that they might be seen and their secret motives guessed at by other people. So it's a very uncomfortable kind of environment in some ways. And also, much of the substance of the story we read when Ailish has returned is a state of agonizing over what to do. There's not that much that happens, but there's an awful lot of uncertainty and deliberation and self-doubt.
Well, the premise for the novel is set up with what to do about this child that's coming, and that's left up in the air completely. Like, she doesn't know what is going to happen. So that is shadowing the whole novel. And then there's a whole series of other what to do sort of situations. I think emerging, as always, I think with Tóibín's writing, out of the things that are left unsaid. People never say what they really think. They never articulate exactly what's going on, sometimes because they don't know. And there's an agonising aspect to it within their own characterisation, that they're genuinely lost in this problematic social situation. But sometimes out of a kind of manoeuvring, a social manoeuvring, which is going on all the time. And we get a lot of that in this novel, back in Long Island initially, around the family, but also in Enniscorthy. And I think Nancy's deployment of that surveillance towards the end of the novel is a very interesting sort of way in which you can manipulate the town for your own purposes. When she lays her claim on Jim by making it public, all the things that have been hidden are now revealed in order to protect her investment, if we can put it that way.
That's right. So essentially, when she perceives that she's at risk of losing Jim to Ailish, Nancy puts on her old engagement ring from her former husband, which she struggles to fit, agonizingly cutting through her knuckle as she squeezes it onto her finger, and then sets about telling everyone in the town, beginning with Ailish's mother, that she is engaged to Jim Farrell.
She's incredibly strategic about this sort of announcement.
As if daring him to now undo it all, to now break the engagement.
She knows Jim, though. She knows he's a fairly passive character, I suspect. But I thought that was really an interesting move in the narrative, because up to this point, that sense of small town surveillance, whether it's in Long Island in their street with the family, or whether it's in Enniscorthy, is seen as somewhat restrictive and claustrophobic, and that there's a sense of that there's a restriction there. But it's interesting how Nancy turns it to her own advantage. It's also something you can deploy if you're a skillful social operator.
We've talked a lot about Ailish and a little bit about Nancy as assertive characters, perhaps assertive against their initial instincts or against what is expected of them. And you mentioned that Jim is a somewhat passive character. Can you tell us a little bit more about Jim?
Jim is interesting because he takes up so readily with Ailish when she comes back and doesn't give too much of a thought towards Nancy, which is callous in many ways, but also perhaps speaks to the fact that he goes with what's been presented with him to him, I think. So when he was abandoned by Ailish in Brooklyn and Nancy presented herself, then he took advantage of that. And now Ailish has presented herself, he's taking advantage of that. So there's a sense that he has no sense of an autonomous sense of making a life. He's inherited the pub. It's going well. He doesn't do much to change it. There's a passivity there, which as the crisis emerges for him between Nancy and Ailish and his affections and which way he's going to go, it's interesting that it looks like a kind of paralysis, that he cannot make choices. He's never seems to have made choices, and now he's not going to be able to do it at this point. So the fantasy that he'll go to the US, I think, is exactly that, it seems to me, given his character. And in that way, it made me think of the kind of old-style paralysis that we see, the theme of paralysis that comes out of Joyce's Dubliners.
Oh, wow.
You know, particularly a character like Eveline, that story where she's going to go to Argentina and she can't get on the boat. Even though her life back home is terrible, she can't imagine the life elsewhere either. And I think he is somewhat like that, not quite as psychologically impoverished as poor Eveline, but he is left at the end completely marooned in his own stasis, I think. I'll just read out and this is from the end of the novel. It's a bit of a spoiler, I suppose, but it doesn't, I think we've covered all the ground already.
We have, yeah.
Yeah. Jim stood in his hallway trying to see Eilish, trying to hear what she might say. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. Maybe tomorrow he would have some idea what to do. But for now, he would wait here, do nothing. He would listen to his own breathing and be ready to answer the door when Nancy came at midnight. That is what he would do. And that's where the novel ends.
God, waiting. He asks questions of Eilish that are never answered.
Yeah.
And he knows that he can't press those questions for fear that she will leave.
Yeah.
And we're left with this sort of unanswered question, this pregnant pause, if you don't mind the pun on the book.
Yeah, and this sense of nothingness, and it's nicely presented in the imagery of this. He's in the hallway. He's not in the house. He's not outside the house. He's in the hallway. He's kind of in this in-between space. He's between these women, between two lives that he's imagining. But he gets the relief of doing nothing at this point. And it's interesting how often that comes up in Tóibín's writing, the sort of nothingness, which I think stems out of the continuous, as you mentioned before, the agonizing sort of tension about what to do, what does someone mean when they say that, what do I mean when I say that, those kind of agonistic sort of reflections in characters all the time in Tóibín's writing more generally.
Decision is tortuous, although at the same time Eilish has come to realise the cost of allowing other people to make decisions in her behalf all the time. So there's a dilemma there between inaction and action, isn't there?
Yeah. And I think the inaction side of things seems to be worse. Like Jim is the more pathetic character in that regard.
That's right. He's an interesting contrast with Nancy because she is something of an opportunist in the way, as you said, that she took up the idea of running a chip shop and made a pile of money, whereas Jim is someone who kind of drifts into what is presented to him, in one case, taking over the family pub. Is that very fatalistic? Is it very Catholic? Is that the fact of most people's lives at this point in the 20th century in Ireland? That unlike now, when many people reading Tóibín's books would be able to bring about international mobility if they wanted to, people in this world can't.
Yeah, I think he is probably not in that situation because he's relatively wealthy. I think there's a sort of class thing going on in this novel as well that Nancy and Eilish both sort of note in the way that Eilish says, well, he took no notice of me before, and then when I returned, I was suddenly interesting and had a sort of aura of money about me. Well, not that it was so deliberate, but there was a sense of possible wealth. And I think he takes that for granted. And there's a kind of class distinction within the town.
Sure is, because actually at the beginning, Nancy is attacked verbally by the banker and his wife, and it's made clear that she is the wrong sort of person.
Yeah.
So there are these class distinctions, you're right, and Jim is maybe not attuned to them in the sense that things have fallen in his lap, but the cost of that is that he's not fulfilled, that he hasn't tested himself or explored his horizons.
Yeah, or when the difficulty arrives, he doesn't have the kind of wherewithal psychologically to respond to it because he's never had to struggle. Whereas Ailish and Nancy both have, and they've both made something of themselves in that way. The idea of property is really important. I'm not sure how Catholic it is, but I think it's that sense of property being important in an Irish context around having something that you provides security so that you won't have to emigrate.
Yes.
I think that sense is powerful here, that if I can build something around myself, then I might be able to hold on to my home. I might hold on to this life that I have. Otherwise, I'll have to go to the US. I'll have to go to England.
Well, you remind us of a strange paradox about the way characters in this world think about emigration. On the one hand, an emigrant such as Ailish can be very glamorous, but on the other hand, there appears to be the underlying assumption that the individual migrates out of desperation rather than the lure of the new place. It's push rather than pull. It's being repelled by the lack of opportunity in Ireland more than it is the attraction of the new environment. So it seems to be both at the same time. An emigrant is both pushed out and down on luck, but is also transformed into this American subject who has lots of money and gorgeous skin and a nice handbag.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it's not really that kind of celebration of Irish America or anything like
Certainly
that.
Certainly not. No.
It's more, as you say, a sense of a lack of opportunity. Not an absolute desperation. It's not like, Ailish is terribly poor.
No.
It's just that there's a lack of opportunity in 1951, and her family decide that she'll have better chance. Turns out that's true. By emigrating. But that sense of what that does to the Irish in America is interesting, because Ailish is a success story and does flourish, and for reasons around the period of the emergence of feminism in the 70s might have something to do with it as well, that she feels the kind of freedom to do so. But we get the other side of that too, with the figure of the Irishman who confronts her in the first scenes of the novel, who is that old-style patriarchal figure. Almost, I almost wanted to call him a sort of stage Irishman in some ways, in his sort of absolutism. So not a buffoon, but a tyrant.
But this man never thinks about Ailish. I noticed that's very interesting. He never reflects on what it must be like for her to find out that her husband is unfaithful and has fathered a child with another woman.
Oh, yeah. He doesn't see her as an ally at any point. No,
she is the enemy.
Yeah, she
she's married.
is.
She has married the enemy.
Yeah, and she's got to take the problem from him. So he's the other picture, I think, of the Irish in America. They're continuing a kind of conservatism, a conservative family model that is taken over and continues and flourishes.
And yet very atomistically, there's obviously no sense of kinship between Ailish and this other Irishman who confronts her on her doorstep, that to integrate is to become completely separate. Whereas in Brooklyn, when she arrives, she mingles with the other members of the Irish community. Here it seems that when you've established yourself in America, you become an individual American and you don't keep up those ties. There's no assumption that Ailish and this Irish newcomer should be friendly to each other.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because in Brooklyn, it's very much the Irish community is important to the new immigrant. But now that she's an American now, that no longer seems to apply. But we do hear her commenting on that she knows that he's telling the truth. She gets the feeling that he really will do this. And because she knows this kind of man, it seems, she recognises him as a particular kind of man that she might have met in Enniscorthy.
How much do we gain from this sequel then, from this extension of the story of Ailish Lacey? If I put it to you directly, do we need this book? Does it tell us new things that we couldn't really extrapolate ourselves from reading Brooklyn? Does it complicate the picture of what it is to be among the Irish diaspora at this point in the 20th century? What would you say?
Well, it was interesting. When I finished it, I thought, it wasn't as it wasn't as gripping as Brooklyn, in the way that this terrible anxiety that you have reading Brooklyn, that how is she going to resolve this? What is she doing? She's married to a man back in Brooklyn. How is this going to end up? That sort of anxiety as a reader was very compelling, and that was less present in this one.
It's sort of reversed, isn't it? Because it's left to Jim to resolve it this time. It's Jim who feels that he's choosing between two women, or thinks that he's choosing between two women.
Yeah, but I don't think he's going to bother choosing. He's going to let the women choose themselves. But thinking about it further, I think it's interesting. It is a worthy addition, because I think it goes into the fantasy of home, or the difficulty of imagining a place that you call home.
You can never return home.
Well, she has been transformed, and so Enniscorthy cannot be seen or experienced the same way as it once was. So I think it's an interesting excursion into that territory, and as a kind of Irish American, and the sort of values around, it's a great scene where she buys all those white goods for her mother.
Well, what I found interesting about that, the scene in which Ailish returns home from America and feels that her mother needs to modernise the house. So she buys Mrs. Lacey a whole set of appliances that she doesn't want. And it struck me that this kind of duplicates the arrival of the unwanted baby in Ailish's house, is the arrival of the unwanted appliances in her mother's house.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but that's a nice parallel. Yeah, well, Mrs. Lacey is resentful and leaves them in the hall, somewhat like the baby might be left on the front doorstep. But then comes around to the idea. She actually quite likes the...
Is it because her American grandchildren are visiting and that she wants to show an acceptable home for them? Do you think that's why she changes her mind about the appliances?
She's a great character, Mrs. Lacey. She's so bloody minded and manipulative herself as well. Yeah, perhaps that she's wanting to be a modern figure, because she finds she really likes her grandchildren being her, but particularly Rosella, that she wants to be. And then, of course, she says, I'm coming with you. I'm coming to the US.
Much to Ailish's surprise.
Yeah, so the attraction, I think, of the American life starts to occur to her. And it's interesting that the children too, what's his name? Larry, yeah. The son, Ailish's son, and Rosella start to integrate themselves into village life. Larry, who at the beginning of the novel identifies with Naples.
Yes.
He's got a map of Naples on his wall, even though the family's not really from Naples. But he's, that sort of Italian-American sort of simplification of Italy, And then he starts to do the same thing with Ireland, and he starts to talk like a guy down at the pub and enjoying the rugby sort of results, and swearing and drinking, and starts to really see the attraction of Irish culture. So it's quite a funny sort of shift in that this teenage character moving from from Italian American to Irish American, sort of fulfilling all the stereotypes along the way.
And it's a sort of update, isn't it, on what we get in the first novel, Brooklyn. A later consequence of that is when the migrant returns with children who might not be fully Irish. They might have some other cultural heritage entirely, and that adds something that we didn't see.
Yeah.
As opposed to the Ireland then of Brooklyn, which is set at the outset in 1951, do you think Tóibín has particular interests in the Ireland of 1976? We're told about examples of recent history. One is a kind of economic shift with the advent of supermarkets, which will threaten the local grocer. Another moment in history, which comes across Jim's mind, is the bombing of Dublin in 1974. Do you think that Tóibín wanted to explore this historical moment? Is there more to it than simply adding to Ailish's history. And he wants to look at Ireland in the 1970s particularly.
Yeah, I think there is that, because the shift from an island that has been, it's often described as relatively static from independence to what is it, 1965, and Sean Lemass opens up the economy, and so we're at this point where a kind of dialogue with the rest of the world, the common market is opening up, and Ireland is keen to join into that in Europe.
Ireland has just joined the European community, and the previous decade was one in which the incoming money was from American multinationals, and that America was not only a site to which Irish people would migrate, but now America was pumping money into Ireland and setting up businesses there, like Pfizer and so on.
Yeah, and Ireland, I think, is right is keen to be involved in Europe right from the start of the project. It's I think an obvious step for this story for a character like Eilish to be able to represent that sort of shift to a new modernity, a late 20th century modernity that becomes more recognisable to, as you say, readers in the 21st century who are globally mobile and that sort of thing. We're seeing the origins of that kind of world in the figure of Eilish, in that she's dislocated from home, or is ambiguous about where home is, but is also reaping the benefits of that kind of mobility in material terms, but also in terms of autonomy and freedom. So I think it is a significant sort of step, not just in this small story of these people, but this step around a different kind of society that's emerging, which will perhaps do away with the kind of small-scale questions that are the intrigues of the town and that sort of thing, and will be connected. Because it's interesting that this sort of story, where the secrets between New York and Wexford are able to be maintained, which of course in the next iteration, if there were another iteration, that would be increasingly difficult to maintain given the mobility of people, the mobility of information. So if this trajectory, and, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a third,
Set in 2001?
Maybe.
2025, or the year of 9/11?
Something. There would have to be some significant hook to hang it on. Because I think this sort of narrative of modernisation is also what's going on here.
Could we maybe talk about the sea in this novel a little bit? Because I said that very little of it is actually set in Long Island, but at a number of points, Eilish does revert to memories of being at the seaside in America, and these are often symbolic moments of being with and witnessing her family, watching her family bonding, seeing Larry crawling towards the sea for the first time. And then there are important moments by the sea in Wexford as well, such as when Eilish stays in her brother's house by the Cush and Jim tracks her down.
Yeah, and the memory of the sea also applies to Enniscorthy too. She's got photographs of the time when she was there before and was having the first affair with Jim.
Oh gosh!
And they're all by the seaside.
And he never swam again. We're told he's never gone in the sea since Eilish
That's interesting.
left.
and then they are discovered at Cush by Nancy. And and I think the sea is interesting, and it's a recurring image in Tóibín's writing around. It does a number of things. There's the obvious sort of correlation with desire and freedom and the kind of embodiment, which is present in this novel and in the little liaison in Cush, but it's also the kind of open possibility, of course, of the shore, of leaving.
It sure is. In the first novel, Brooklyn, the sea is the mode of Eilish's migration. And there are moments in that novel when she swims very far out from Tony, and she swims so far out that to us it seems like it hints at the idea of migration. Not that you're going to sensibly attempt to swim from America to Ireland, but
yeah. And that sense that there is you're in a space where you could transition to somewhere else, and there's a possibility of another kind of life, which Tóibín has used again and again. It made me think of The Heather Blazing, where there's the final scenes in that novel where the High Court judge, Eamon Redmond, is playing with his illegitimate grandson that there's, such contention about in the novel in the sea. And there's this kind of quasi-baptismal sort of imagery,
Yeah.
There's all sorts of resonance.
Religious sea.
Yeah, but also freedom as well. So either the kind of ritual sea or the sea of freedom. And I think that's at play in this one again, around the possibilities of desire, the possibilities of escape, but also in the unstable nature of it, the kind of the sense that the shoreline changes, that the sea changes, that there is no stability to be had here, that one has to respond continuously to a changing environment.
We're all in a sea.
Well, we're all in an environment that we have to negotiate, I think.
We're all drowning.
It's possible. That's the problem. It's possible. And you'll be seen. I think the surveillance, we were talking about the surveillance aspect of the small community. It's interesting that Nancy sees them when they're down by the seashore, where there's nowhere to hide.
She crawls down on all fours so that they won't see her, but there's no way for them to conceal themselves from her gaze.
Yes. So it's a kind of there's a kind of honesty to the sea because everything is visible.
The shore, it's a very stark sight, isn't it? It's never rocky or complicated. It's always a very bare setting in these novels.
Yeah. And so if there is intrigue, it will become evident. If there's desire, it will become evident.
You reveal yourself.
You reveal yourself.
By the sea.
That's right.
Yeah, you take off your clothes and you get in the sea.
Yeah. This is sort of naked honesty, which is a kind of relief given that there is so little upfront and exposed.
Yeah, there's so much disguise and evasion.
Yeah.
Thank you, Matt.
Pleasure, Chris.
Irish Books is hosted by Christopher Murray and produced by Martin Franklin for East Coast Studio, with support from the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Embassy of Ireland, Australia, and Monash University.